What's happening, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review episode 6 of season 2 of The Expanse, an episode that was called Paradigm Shift, a highly appropriate title, as will be readily apparent once I get into the gist of the episode. And I have to say, while this episode was definitely more of not a filler episode, but it was a fresh start to the second half of the season. For people who don't know, the previous episode, episode 5, which was absolutely extraordinary, essentially brought the entire storyline of the first book of the series to a close, which is why it had that enormous emotional impact, and people were justifiably freaking out about it. It was absolutely an extraordinary episode. This is really the step one in a whole new story arc, so you had to kind of adjust your expectations, slow down, have some more characters introduced, create the foundation for the next big drama to come. But, thankfully, it does give us a little tease at the end of some major events, and if you've read ahead in the books at all, the second book is called Caliban's War. We're basically getting into the meat of the story at the beginning of that novel, and I couldn't be more thrilled because I'm just about finished with reading Caliban's War right now, and there is all kinds of cool, crazy shit coming our way in the very near future. Whether or not season 2 will wrap up the events of book 2, I highly doubt it. I mean, it took them about 15 episodes between season 1 and 2 to do the first book, so it wouldn't surprise me at all if the end of book 2 is essentially the end of season 3. But either way, I put my faith and my trust in the showrunners. They seem to really know what they're doing. I might have the occasional nitpicky grievance about certain decisions they make, but overall, very, very pleased with the show. One thing I really love about this episode was a flashback about how the Epstein drive was invented, which was 137 years ago in Expanse chronology. The Epstein drive is what allowed humans to essentially conquer our solar system, move beyond Mars, settle the belt, so on and so forth. It's what totally changed the face of human civilization. Spoiler alert, if you haven't watched the episode, stop now, because I am going to be going into details from the episode. But the sad fate of Epstein is that he found a way to be incredibly fast and fuel efficient with his engines, but he didn't take into account the pressure it was going to put on his body. And he had already turned off the voice activation on his console, so he was unable to stop the ship and turn around, and he slowly just got crushed to death by high G's. His blood vessels in his eyes are bursting and that sort of thing. He eventually died from a stroke, but you see like his arm popping and breaking, and at any rate, his wife or widow is going to be a very, very wealthy woman, or became a wealthy woman. But the Epstein drive was a paradigm shift that changed everything. Technology always has massive ramifications, some that are intentional, some that are unintentional. And that ties into the paradigm shift of episode 6, where the protomolecule, known only to a few, crashed into Venus. Most people assume that the protomolecule is gone and that it just evaporated going into the atmosphere of Venus. However, there's a lot of mistrust now about who has access to the remaining samples, what should be done with them, so on and so forth. The big debate on the Rocinante was what to do with their sample. Miller told Naomi he trusted them to do what is best, and Holden basically wants to fire it into the sun. Alex is of the opinion that it should be given to Mars because they have the best scientists. But what's interesting about the Rocinante is that they are a microcosm of the overall conflict in the solar system, because Alex is from Mars and Holden is from Earth. Naomi's from the Belt. I believe Amos was born on Earth but basically grew up in the Belt. I'd have to double check Amos's background, but they represent all the various factions, which is what makes their family unit so fun to watch. While this debate goes on, there's another debate about what happened to all the missiles that were fired trying to potentially destroy the Eros, because they shot 150 into space and only about 120 were found and reclaimed or deactivated by the UN, which is the Earth forces. And then Holden realizes, once he has a meeting with Fred, that the OPA essentially, with a giant net, captured 30. Whether or not they use them, or use them as a bargaining chip, or use them as leverage, or as a deterrent, Fred is definitely positioning himself to be a new giant power in the solar system. Obviously, the Belt is not going to rival Earth or Mars, but they're no longer just going to be society's outcasts living on the fringe. But that leads to some friction between Fred and Holden, because Fred believes that he's played it straight with Holden, that Holden should trust him. Holden clearly is suspicious of Fred's ulterior motives, whatever his final goals might be. So there's definitely just some ongoing give and take with those two guys. They're both very, very headstrong. They both have very clear visions of what is right and wrong, and they just don't always see eye to eye. While in past episodes, I've given a little grief to some of the depictions of the characters on Earth, just because I feel like a lot of times they're just there to explain what's happening so that people can get up to speed, which obviously is useful. It's just less exciting. But we do get an interesting bit where a scientist comes to Avasarala, I believe is her name. I'm never quite sure if I'm saying that correctly, but that's how it's spelled. But he knows that with the arrows crashing on Venus, that they're not done with the protomolecule. He basically wants permission to be her eyes and ears and go study the effects firsthand. I won't go into it, but if you've read the books, you know that, I just said I'm not going to go into it, so I'm contradicting myself. At the very end of this video, I might do a few little bits and pieces talking about the books and the differences, but for now let's just stick to what we got in the episode. If I had one bone to pick with this episode, is that there are some scenes in this that definitely feel like filler, as the show's kind of just exhaling and taking a breath before the next big drama to come, which is probably useful. You can't always be at a high-pitched, like massively climactic drama, or just nothing will seem climactic. I mean, everything will fall apart. So you just need to have a little downtime. So we see Amos and Alex getting into bar fights and things like that, and having arguments about whether or not Alex needs Amos's protection and that sort of thing. Amos kind of divides people into those that you follow, those that are your enemies, and those that you protect. And Alex basically says, look, you don't need to protect me. I can fight my own battles, etc. But none of these, I guess they're character building scenes, they don't really drive the plot forward. The really interesting thing in this episode, which is a slight difference from the book, is Holden agrees, or everyone agrees, to fire the protomolecule sample into the sun. Naomi agrees to do so, and she basically fires up a simulation showing to Holden that she has done so, but it turns out she did not, which is a little interesting breach of trust between these two characters. And then Naomi goes to work with one of Fred's underlings to start dismantling and taking control over the other nuclear missiles that they have captured. So it's interesting seeing how Naomi is playing both sides. But Naomi is a belter, so that makes sense. The episode draws to a close with the big, massive... Well, not the big, massive action set piece. The beginning of the big, massive action set piece that begins the second book, Caliban's War. On Ganymede Agricultural Station, which is a giant moon of Jupiter that is jointly held by both the UN and Mars. This is essentially a giant moon for growing food in these enormous greenhouses, and that food feeds a huge portion of the solar system, the belt, anyone around there, but it's just a big, massive greenhouse. And Bobby Draper, the badass Martian soldier that we saw at the beginning of the season, we see her and her unit patrolling the grounds, and it seems like pretty uneventful duty, but they're at least out there in the field, and there is tension because there is kind of a demilitarized zone or border that is not disputed, but just that everyone's aware of between the UN and Mars. They control their various sides, and it's kind of a watchful peace between the two sides. All hell breaks loose when there's a lot of things that start happening all at once. In essence, you don't know what sparks what, and obviously we'll learn more in the subsequent episodes. But right when Bobby notices that something seems to be flying overhead and observing them, they also notice 6 UN soldiers charging their way. They immediately assume they're under attack. But as we see as they're getting closer, they're not attacking Bobby and her friends. They're turning around and firing at something that is chasing them. And you can barely see it. It's off in the distance, but it's clearly not human. It's larger, it's taller, it's faster, and they're freaking out and running toward us. At the same time, a pitched battle breaks out between UN forces and Martian forces up in space, up in orbit above Ganymede, and ships are getting blown up and falling, and it's just total chaos. But as the pieces of a giant Martian ship lands on the surface of Ganymede, we see that Bobby's unit has been completely decimated and torn to pieces. She's lying there, totally bruised and battered, air's escaping through a hole in her mask, and this foul, disgusting, horrible creature suddenly looms over her with blue luminescent lights, and he's looking down at her, and we see that that same thing that was monitoring her before is above the creature. And in the show, everything fades to blue or goes really, really bright, so we don't see what's going to happen yet. This is basically the beginning of Bobby as a badass. And, everything that happened early in this season was a way of introducing her. I still hold that they didn't need to, I guess, pull her forward just to get us invested, because the scenes with her and her unit just felt a little shoved in. The really, really cool stuff with Bobby is this stuff we're seeing now and moving forward. She's, I don't know if it's a spoiler or not. I'll just say I absolutely love her character in the book, and she's giant, she's strong, and with that suit on, she's basically a fucking superhero, and she's a lot of fun to watch in action. So I can't wait to see more of her, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of acting chops the actress has who's playing her. But this is the end of my official recap of the episode because I do want to talk a little bit about just differences between. If you haven't read the books, tune out now. But I'm just gonna make one final point for people who have. I just want to get people's opinions on this. But was it a mistake not showing the battle between Bobby and the creature? Because obviously, I have a feeling we'll see the battle through her camera POV, through her suit, in a few episodes down the line as they start to try and verify her story. And so maybe they're just using that as like a teaser to whet our appetite so that we'll be really, really thrilled and excited when we see it. But I was a little disappointed not to see that battle just because it's so damn cool. And just, people getting thrown around, everybody blasting it, like all the filaments coming out and then it filling in. It's just a really, really cool sequence in the book. So I kept thinking like, oh, we're going to get it. And then we didn't get it. So I have a feeling they're holding it off. But or maybe they had to reduce it because of budgetary constraints, because as written, it's a pretty wild, over-the-top, like superhero type battle almost. So hopefully we will still see that, but it'll be interesting to see just how much the series and the books diverge, because it seems like, for the most part, the books are the DNA, the backbone, and the show is zigging and zagging a little bit away from the books, but for the most part, being pretty faithful. So I'm a very satisfied fan. I just was hoping to see a little more action this episode, but as I mentioned before, I think it was just filler to keep us going. And we still got, 7 to 13, so 7, 8, 9. Yeah, we still got 7 episodes left to go, so lots of good shit coming our way. Hope you've enjoyed this reaction video and review. Hope you're enjoying The Expanse. If you're loving it, spread the word, because I feel like this show is still, flying under the radar too much. This show should be as popular as Battlestar Galactica was at its peak. And I want The Expanse to stick around for a long time, so let's all do our part, and on social media and on YouTube and that sort of thing, spread the word and get everybody watching The Expanse, reading The Expanse, so on and so forth. So if you enjoyed this, please give me a subscribe and a comment below. You can find me on Twitter at Colbrax, and I'll be back tomorrow with a review of the new movie, Logan. So long.